Good afternoon, everyone. I will be providing you an overview of the reactivation of the Validate As You Go, also known as VAYGo, process. So here are our agenda items. We will discuss the background of VAYGo. We will go over the VAYGo goals. And then we will discuss the changes to the VAYGo guide. Then we will go into the documentation collection and review. Then we will look at some of the requirements for the VAYGo closeout benefit, which is also known as the VCB submission. We will discuss the eligibility notification for the VCB. Then we will go over some of the VAYGo restart items. So some background on VAYGo. In 2019, FEMA implemented the Validate As You Go, or VAYGo, grant payment review process for Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the hurricane declarations. In December 2020, VAYGo was expanded to all disasters, beginning with those declared in fiscal year 2020, which included COVID. In the spring of 2022, the VAYGo process was paused to evaluate the approach and identify the best way forward to achieve our collective goals. This comprehensive review included listening sessions throughout the nation and the issuance of the draft guide for review and comments. The input that FEMA received has been incorporated into the new VAYGo guide. So here are some of the VAYGo goals. So FEMA aims to improve the grants management internal control process by consistently assessing payment error rates to provide potential payment integrity issues ahead of time and mitigating them before it gets to closeout. The VAYGo review supports grants monitoring by accelerating collection of adequate supporting documentation and making it available to FEMA for grant monitoring activities. By doing this, it can reduce the redundant collection of documentation and in the early identification of ineligible costs and procurement issues. As FEMA testing is restarted, FEMA is heavily focused on the consistent implementation of VAYGo across the nation. VAYGo complies with the Payment Integrity Information Act of 2019, or PIIA, which requires payment integrity to be identified, assessed, prioritized, and responded to prevent improper payments. Through the VAYGo testing process, recipients are allowed to remediate question costs and take appropriate actions to strengthen internal controls throughout the grant lifecycle. This could reduce or prevent the likelihood of future improper payments. The new VAYGo process ensures consistency in implementation with the issuance of a national VAYGo guide, which provides transparency, establishes timelines, definitions, and communication channels that help ensure a consistent understanding and implementation of testing. Another goal is to streamline the process, reduce the duplication of effort on recipients for submitting documentation to FEMA, and simplifies closeout through the VAYGo closeout benefit, or VCB. Under the VAYGo closeout benefit, recipients that achieve and maintain a low error rate of question costs at or below 1.5, which is the OMB threshold for 2 consecutive cycles, which is 2 testing cycles, are eligible for the VCB. The VCB applies to large projects for Harvey, Irma, and Maria disasters and all disasters declared in FY 2020 and forward, including COVID-19. So some of the changes to the VAYGo guide. As a result of the listening sessions, a new VAYGo guide was developed in collaboration with VAYGo Headquarters Public Assistance, GPD, the regions, and SLTTs. The guide provides standardization for the testing process, including roles and responsibilities, documentation requirement, and communication. Now, the documentation requirements. The VAYGo guide includes descriptive tables that outline clear documentation requirements based on cost to claim, and the table also aligns with the Papa G version 4 and the 422 Simplified Procedures policy. Now, the timelines has also increased to reduce the burden on regions, recipients, and subrecipients. So the days to submit documentation has increased from 30 days to now 60 days, and the request for information has increased from 10 days to now 30 days. The communication opportunities has also improved. There will be an established entrance call, there will be weekly progress calls, and there will be an exit call, which includes VAYGo headquarters PA, the regions, and our SLTTs. The entrance call is to first set expectations and to get an understanding of the recipient's financial system. And this is to understand how disbursements are made to subrecipients. Also, reimbursement process. And this is the recipients collecting documentation at the time of the disbursements. Are funds dispersed at a 50% rate or at a 100% rate? And it also looks at the internal controls. Are there internal controls in place and are they being applied? And also potential issues that could impact the testing process. Additionally, the guide implements the VAYGo closeout benefit, also called the VCB. For those STTs that achieve a VAYGo error rate at or below the 1.5% for 2 consecutive testing cycles are eligible for the simplified closeout process. The eligibility continues as long as the error rate level is maintained. Recipients will no longer need to provide payment or contract documentation and will only be required to submit the following. And recipients will only be required to submit a certification that the financial reconciliation has been performed and that the costs align with the project's improved scope of work and documentation of insurance and EHP compliance. Recipients are responsible for providing the documentation necessary to demonstrate the funding associated with the testing drawdown was properly dispersed. And this includes such items, but not limited to proof of payment documentation of the expenses, contract costs, and an itemized list informing the reviewer what items were included in that particular payment. Now, this itemized list could be a spreadsheet, a ledger, or something of that nature, just to direct the analyst or reviewer of what costs are associated with that particular drawdown amount. OCFO and PA Business Architect team has collaborated on updates to the VAYGo module in Grants Manager and Grants Portal, so uploading the documentation can be simpler and available to recipients and analysts. So VAYGo performs transactional testing to ensure that associated costs within documentation are correct and in accordance with laws and regulations. There are 2 types of reviews that the VAYGo analyst or reviewer performs during the transactional testing. Now, that is a completeness review and also a compliance review. Now, with the completeness review, this consists of verifying that the documentation provided supports the disbursement amount paid to the subrecipient. Now, the compliance review consists of ensuring that documentation adheres to FEMA policies, PAPA G, 2 CFR Part 200, and 44 CFR, as well as within the eligible scope of work written in the project worksheet. So the requirements for the VAYGo closeout benefit participation. Recipients that achieve an error rate at or below 1.5% for 2 consecutive cycles are eligible for this simplified closeout process. The eligibility continues as long as the error rate level is maintained. When a recipient qualifies for the VCB, there's no need to submit financial documentation for all events or for the disaster claim on or after October the 1st, 2019 to include COVID. Recipients will only be required to submit a certification for any projects submitted for closeout during the eligibility period. Specifically, a recipient will not need to provide the normal required financial documentation such as force account labor, force account equipment, material supplies, and contract, etc., because those documentations have already been submitted for the VAYGo process. So FEMA will already have those documentation. So those documents also tend to be large in nature, therefore alleviate the need for submittal to FEMA represents an administrative relief to the recipients. Requirements for the VCB project submission. So FEMA will be looking for a certification that costs were validated and expended in accordance with the obligated scope of work. Cost summaries with proof of payment information will not be required, and this to ensure that all payments were made in accordance with the FEMA State Territorial Tribal Agreement and 44 CFR 206.205. FEMA will accept the recipient's provided certification for cost expenditures rather than having to provide full or detailed cost documentation. Recipients would need to provide documentation which demonstrates that any conditions placed on the project during review have been fulfilled. And some examples of that is environmental and historic preservation permits or insurance obtain and maintain documentation. Subrecipients must comply with the EHP laws, regulations, and executive orders, including but not limited to the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and also the National Historic Preservation Act. So additional requirements for project submission. FEMA must ensure that the project complies with appropriate EHP laws, regulations, and executive orders. Applicants must afford FEMA the opportunity to perform EHP reviews prior to starting any work that has potential to impact the environment or historic properties, including archaeological resources. If an applicant starts work prior to FEMA completion of the EHP review, it jeopardizes PA funding for the entire project. Such situations may compel FEMA to revoke federal funding for those portions of the project that fail to meet the EHP compliant requirements. Information associated with any cost overrun. If an overrun is requested, please provide supporting documentations to validate, also included proof of cost. Recipients will submit any documentation to include cost and detailed explanation of why the overrun is being requested. And it should also be noted that recipients and subrecipients are still required to maintain project-related documentation as required by 2 CFR 200.334. There is no changes to the documentation retention part. You are still required to maintain your documentation for the 3 years after the final report. Communication of the eligibility for participation in the VCB. So for those recipients who are eligible for the VCB will be identified by FEMA headquarters VAYGo team. And then they will in turn inform the PA headquarters team. Then the headquarters team will then notify the regional VAYGo POCs of who have qualified for the VCB. The VAYGo regional POCs will notify recipients who have qualified for the VCB and then inform the recipients of the documentation and information that must be included with the closeout package for each project. So the VAYGo restart. The restart memo was issued on August 8th. The VAYGo team is focusing on completing FY21 quarters 1 and quarters 2 sample, and then we'll move into remediation. The new guide will apply to FY21 quarters 3 and quarters 4 and future fiscal years. The guidance includes the VAYGo guide, the VAYGo closeout benefit fact sheet, and FAQs. These documents are available on the Public Assistance FEMA.gov site and on the VAYGo landing page for your review. FEMA will be conducting restart webinars to include the training webinars, and these will be virtual and in person. The next testing cycle is scheduled to begin in November of FY21 for FY21 quarters 3 and quarters 4. There will be scheduled entrance call held prior to the next testing cycle, as well as weekly progress calls. So the engagement opportunities will be very important to the success of the VAYGo testing process.
To find the resources mentioned throughout this webinar, go to FEMA.gov at www.fema.gov, and in the search bar, type VAYGo with no spaces, and then either press enter or click the magnifying glass. The first option should be what you want. You're looking for the title that spells out Validate As You Go. Click on the link, and you will be brought to the Validate As You Go landing page. If you scroll down, you'll see both the Validate As You Go guide as well as the Validate As You Go closeout benefit fact sheet. For additional questions on the VAYGo process, here are some contacts.
Now we have some compliance information for you.
To report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and/or misconduct, contact the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General by phone at 1-800-323-8603 or via the website or mailing address listed on the screen now. Procurement requirements are among the most complicated parts of the PA grant process, and noncompliance can result in deobligation of funding. Please make sure that you are following FEMA's procurement guidance for recipients and subrecipients. Federal requirements for procurement and contracting are described in 2 CFR Part 200. The Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, or PDAT, offers some training and tools on their website, www.fema.gov/grants/procurement.
Thank you for watching.